Sure.
All right, so welcome everyone to our new event of the Neurohumanities Network. Just as a reminder of who we are, we're a group of neurologists, of trainees that are interested in the intersection of the humanities and the brain, neurology. We are lucky to have a huge team. You'll see some old faces, some new names. So our team keeps growing, and we're so excited to welcome new people. We also want to acknowledge and thank the support of the Arts and Humanities Initiative at Harvard Medical School. And our wonderful team has really built so many resources. We have these monthly virtual seminars, we have booster sessions, we have a YouTube channel that serves as the lecture archive, so please feel free to check it out. We have social media. We have X, Instagram, Blue Sky, and now even LinkedIn. So you can find us there. We have a newsletter that is being put together by our wonderful team. So get the QR code so that you can subscribe to it. We also have a website, another QR code for you. Really wonderful website that again our team put together. These are our handles on X, Instagram, and Blue Sky. Also find us on LinkedIn. And on to today's seminar. I am extremely excited about this because the doctor's note is such an important part of what we do. And I also love how Dr. Adina Wise named this talk, from whom the note scrolls, a brief history of the medical record and the risks it faces today. Adina Wise is a movement disorder neurologist at Icahn School of Medicine at Mount Sinai, and her research focuses on the genetics of Parkinson's disease and dystonia, but she also has parallel interests in the ethics of emerging technology in neurology, including genetic testing, brain-computer interfaces, and AI. And now she's wearing these two hats, but even more, she's interested in the humanities. She writes at the intersection of medicine and the humanities, and she explores how language, narrative, and culture shape both the patient experience and the practice of neurology. And without further ado, Dr. Wise, I'll have you take it away.
Okay, thank you so much for that kind introduction. And can you see my screen now? Do I
We
need to?
can.
You can. Okay, great. All right. Second. Okay. Okay, so hi everybody. Thank you. It's really wonderful to be here. And just very quickly before I get started, I want to apologize because I think initially this was my fault that when the announcement went out for the talk, it said that I would be talking about narrative medicine and neurology. And that is a topic very near and dear to my heart. But today I'm actually going to be talking about why writing is important to thinking and medicine, and also the history of medical documentation and kind of the challenges that the note faces today. So if you came for narrative medicine, please forgive the bait and switch, but I hope you'll stick around and find this topic worthwhile. So the talk I'm going to share today was actually born out of an article that I wrote for neurology education just about a year ago. And at that time, OpenNotes, the movement and now the federal mandate that gives patients access to their clinical notes, had been around for a couple years. And, basically, I was starting to notice kind of this new pattern in my own clinic where patients were coming in with questions about what they read in their notes, sometimes with worries, sometimes with requests to change what had been written. And my colleagues were having really similar experiences. And so all of this really made me want to ask, what is a medical note? What should be in it? What shouldn't be in it? Who is it for? Who should it be for? And why does any of this matter? So on that note, let's get started. So why write? I know a lot of doctors don't like to write, maybe not the ones here tonight, but in general, a lot of doctors really see writing as a chore. It's kind of a means to an end. And again, there are exceptions. There are some brilliant physician authors, but often it's kind of, slogging through progress notes and grant reports and academic papers and endless emails. And of course, this can all be quite tedious. But so I really want to challenge in this talk, I want to challenge that mindset. And I want to introduce the notion that writing at least note writing. I can't promise anything about emails, but note writing at least about the patient encounter shouldn't be just a bureaucratic requirement. It should really be an essential part of reasoning through the clinical encounter. And so, to further make this point, I just want to start with a few quotes here from some of the writers and thinkers that I really admire. So, the first one is Joan Didion, and she has written, I write entirely to find out what I'm thinking, what I'm looking at, what I see, and what it means. And then, along similar lines, Flannery O'Connor, the fiction short story writer, once wrote, I write because I don't know what I think until I read what I say. And then finally, John Dewey, the philosopher of education, called language the tool of tools, which enables us to reflect, to compare, to abstract, and thereby to think critically. And so, of course, I agree deeply with all three of these, but I'm sure that we are all a little bit wary of decontextualized quotes. So I want to go a little bit further and look at what the evidence actually says about writing as a tool for thinking. So, to start, I want to look briefly at two studies that I think really illustrate this link between writing and critical thinking. And the first study is this one. It's from 2007. It was published in the Journal of Life Sciences Education. And here, researchers used this pre-test, post-test design on 310 undergraduate biology students at a US university. And the students were randomly assigned to either a writing intensive lab or a traditional quiz-based control section. And so, both sections covered the same material. It was the same instructor. So really, they tried to make it so that the only difference was writing versus quiz. And in the writing section, the students completed various structured weekly assignments where they had to interpret data, they had to construct arguments, they had to revise their explanations based on feedback. And the control group, by contrast, only had to complete these weekly quizzes. And then to measure the outcomes, they use the California Critical Thinking Skills Test. And this assesses abilities like analysis, inference, and evaluation. And what they found was that students in the writing group actually showed statistically significant improvements in overall critical thinking scores, particularly in analysis and inference, while the control group actually declined slightly over the same semester. So the authors concluded that writing really does promote critical thinking, not by reinforcing content, but by encouraging students to reason and to articulate evidence and to reflect on their own thinking. And, this is really the exact kind of cognitive work that we ask of medical trainees and hopefully ourselves every day. So this next study, this is from 2021. This is published in the International Journal for the Scholarship of Teaching and Learning, and it approaches the kind of writing thinking connection from more of a sociocultural perspective, asking how writing within community can foster critical thinking. And so here the author looked, was done in Singapore, and the author took a first year university academic writing program. There were about 80 undergraduates who participated in the study, and they were all enrolled in a semester long course where they wrote, they shared, they revised through these structured workshops that emphasized, argumentation, peer feedback, reflective writing. And then the author took a qualitative approach to the data. And what was found was that when writing was framed as a dialogic process, so something that's done with others rather than simply for others or for evaluation, the students really began to internalize the habits of mind that defined critical thought. So they became more likely to question assumptions, to evaluate evidence, and even to revise their own viewpoints. So, in other words, it really wasn't just the act of writing that mattered, it was writing in dialogue. And I think this is an important point to keep in mind as we continue. And so again, these are only two studies of really hundreds on the topic of writing and its relationship to critical thinking. In the interest of time, I won't go through anymore, but if it's something you're interested in, there is much more data available. So moving on, we have to ask another question, which is who cares? Why does any of this matter? who cares that, medical notes contain, who cares who writes them and reads them, and who cares what they're really intended for? And I would argue that, the studies we just looked at really start to tell a story that points us at the very least to why we should care about these questions. And what it suggests is that writing isn't just a necessary evil or a means to an end or a billing practice, but that it has the potential to be really both a powerful pedagogical tool and maybe even a cognitive technology, so to speak. So we are going to start looking backwards, as promised, to the origins of documentation and how the note evolved into the central artifact of medicine that it is today. But as we do that, I really want everyone to keep asking themselves, who is the medical note for? Who gets to write it? And what happens when both the audience and the author change? So, a prominent feature of human history involves intentionally leaving behind traces of our actions or experiences. And some of the earliest evidence that we have of this is actually found in cave paintings. And particularly, these cave paintings date back to about 15,000 to 17,000 years. They were unearthed in the Lascaux cave complex in southwestern France in 1940. And one of the paintings, as you can see here, shows what has been interpreted as a man being attacked by an animal. I hope you can see that here. And there's no real description of the affliction. There's no discernible assessment and plan, of course. So, for some of you, this may feel like a bit of a stretch, but there are people who have argued that this representation is, in fact, the first instance of a medical record. If we fast forward now a few millennia, we find what is much more convincingly one of the earliest known medical documents, which is the Edwin Smith Papyrus. And this document was discovered in fragments in 1862 by an Egyptologist known as Edwin Smith. And it's believed to be a much older text. It's estimated to be from about 3000 BCE. And it focuses on trauma surgery. So it describes in a lot of detail head injuries, spinal damage, fractures with remarkable precision, and it lays out observations, diagnoses, and treatments. And one of the things that's really striking about it is its rational tone. So, at this time, there were a lot of magical, religious, healing texts, but this document is empirical and actually quite procedural. And it's about what the physician sees, what they do, and what happens next. And it's also about telling other physicians what to do and what not to do. So it really is educational in nature as well. So, many historians consider the Edwin Smith Papyrus to be the first true medical document, at least that we have discovered. And I do want to mention, for all the neurology nerds out there like myself, this is pretty cool because it's actually also the first known text to use words like brain, spinal cord, meninges, even CSF gets a shout out. So this is really an important document, and it demonstrates clear clinical documentation, and it provides kind of a marker of medicine becoming this observational science, while also revealing this early evidence of a medical record that was being used to teach. So before we move on from the Edwin Smith Papyrus, I do want to take a moment to look at one of these cases a bit more closely so you can really see what I'm talking about here. So this is the way each case is laid out. You have the title, what we might now call the chief complaint. And in this case that I've picked, the title is Instructions Concerning a Wound in His Temple Penetrating to the Bone and Perforating His Temporal Bone. And then after the title, you have the examination. And it's a very detailed examination, and I won't read it in its entirety, but just to give you a flavor, it says, he discharges blood from both his nostrils and a little drops. If thou puttest thy fingers on the mouth of that wound, and he shudder exceedingly, if thou ask of him concerning his malady, and he speak not to thee right now. And then next comes the diagnosis. And so in part here, that reads, While he discharges blood from both his nostrils, he suffers with stiffness in his neck and he is speechless. And then comes the treatment plan for this condition, which is as follows. Now, when thou findest that man speechless, his relief shall be sitting, soften his head with grease, and pour milk into both of his ears. So, I can't say that I agree entirely with the treatment plan, but I do appreciate the detailed description. And the reason I wanted to share this case in particular is because it's actually been written about as potentially the very first written record of aphasia. As stated repeatedly here, this unfortunate gentleman with a perforating injury to his temporal bone is rendered speechless. And I'm sure that many here can imagine why. So I do highly recommend taking a moment to read this article in its entirety. It's in the Journal of Medical Biography, if you have time. So now we're going to jump forward again to the 5th and 4th centuries BCE. And now the practice of written observation really matures in Greece in the collection which we now know as the Hippocratic Corpus. And this is where the chronological case history really truly emerges. So the physicians who contributed to the Hippocratic Corpus, at this point, they're not just describing disease, they are tracking it. They are mapping the trajectory of illness through time. And so for the first time, medicine itself becomes temporal with a focus really on cause and effect. So the text in the Hippocratic Corpus includes some of the first systematic case notes. These are detailed observations of symptoms, their duration, the day-to-day course of illness, any treatments administered, and the final outcome, whether recovery or death. And each entry unfolds chronologically. As you can see on the slide, this is a complete entry, actually, a very succinct one. And it really lists out day 1, day 2, day 3, and describes exactly what happens. And importantly, what it shows is progression. So, this is a notably sparse entry. It was probably written by someone with more of a surgical mind than a neurologist. But however sparse it is, the structure still feels probably familiar because it's essentially the earliest version of what would later become the progress note. And I think what's especially fascinating is that these notes weren't just written for record keeping. These were also for teaching. They were compiled so that other physicians and especially students could really see the logic of medicine on paper, how the longitudinal details could, in fact, reveal the natural course of disease. And so, in that sense, the Hippocratic Corpus also is both a clinical document and an educational text. So if we jump ahead now about another 2,000 years, we find that Hippocratic rhythm of daily observation and documentation has further progressed. By the 18th and 19th centuries, that chronological approach in clinical documentation has really, in fact, become the backbone of hospital medicine. And so as hospitals expand across Europe, particularly in places like Paris and Vienna and Leiden and Berlin, Edinburgh, the written case history evolves from being a personal reflection that physicians keep for themselves to being an institutional practice. So I want to focus on just a couple of examples of this for a moment. The first one is at the Charité Hospital in Berlin. And we can see kind of this transformation happening in real time there. So this hospital was originally founded in 1710 as a plague house. And when it was founded in the early 18th century, the records were much more administrative. These were kind of lists of diets and rations and orders. And so the notes, were really being used for non-clinical tracking, billing, funding, supply order purposes. But then by the 19th century, the hospital becomes one of Europe's leading medical training centers, and written case documentation begins to take on a new character. So just as was happening in other parts of Europe, bedside teaching is now being paired with systemic writing about patients. And so every patient who enters the Charité at this point generates a written record, which was referred to literally in German, of course, as a history of illness. And I do have the German word up there that I'm not going to try to pronounce. But medical students also were required to write these as part of their training. There were kind of well-renowned professors like Johann Lucas Schönlein, who taught at the Charité in the 1830s, and he would read and critique these notes of the medical students at the bedside. And I'm sure the medical students loved that, but the point really wasn't just accuracy, it was reasoning. Students were learning how to think medically through writing. And just as was happening in other parts of the continent and the world to some extent, bedside teaching, oops, I'm sorry. So then in the mid 19th century, this tradition deepened, and this was under the renowned Rudolf Virchow. And he actually joined the Charité in 1847. And at this point, Virchow began linking each clinical note with its autopsy finding. So he really was creating an early version of a completely integrated medical record. And this, of course, was the birth of what we now know as clinico-pathological correlation, our CPC, which remains really the cornerstone of modern medical reasoning. And Virchow even published many of these. So he was really turning the bedside writing into raw data for scientific publication. Across the continent now, at the Royal Infirmary of Edinburgh, there was a similar transformation underway. And there, professors like James Gregory and then his nephew and successor, William Allison, were requiring medical students to maintain these meticulous casebooks. So these were not just kind of, shorthand logs, but they were actually full-blown narrative diaries. And for them, this was really more than just kind of a helpful aid memoir or habit. It really reflected this kind of dual inheritance of the Scottish Enlightenment, where there's both empirical observation and also moral philosophy. And Gregory was himself a classicist as well as a physician. And so he always taught that medicine was really a form of applied moral philosophy. So his case writing trained students to reason ethically about disease and personhood, not just symptoms. And then in Allison's era, things go even deeper. So at this point, the hospital is no longer doing just bedside science. They actually start doing social science. Allison was very much a proponent of epidemiology and would argue that epidemics, poverty, and disease were intimately connected to each other. And these case books, which were kept so well, really helped provide the clinical evidence of that. So, these really weren't just records. They were practices of listening, reflecting, and weaving medical reasoning into narrative. And as we can see here, many of these handwritten volumes still exist today in the University of Edinburgh archives. And reading them really kind of feels like opening a time capsule. But as you can see, they're also surprisingly modern. Unfortunately, I was unable to find the exact date of this particular entry, but I think it's from the early 20th century. So, initially students were still keeping these handwritten case books kind of for their own personal reflections. But by the time we get to the late 18th century, they're no longer just for the students to keep their own notebooks. They are really an institutional requirement and an educational rite of passage, kind of a demonstration of the student's ability to think clearly. Unfortunately, by the time we get to the mid 20th century, something has gone terribly wrong with the medical record. So as we just saw, in the 18th and 19th centuries, the case record, it was narrative, it was chronological, it was very cognitive, and at least it was heading in that direction. But essentially what happened is that industrialization continued to progress, and with it, the note actually began to fall apart. So now there were kind of, multiple services all coexisting in the hospital. There's lab data, there's imaging data, there are nursing notes, there's all of these distinct issues for each patient. They're all mixed together. And the note has really become kind of a collection of fragments, all written in parallel, very rarely integrated. And so by the 1950s and 60s, hospital charts, particularly in the United States, were massive and they were often quite disorganized. They were duplicative, inconsistent, and pretty opaque. And that is when Lawrence Weed comes onto the scene. So Weed was an internist and an educator at the University of Vermont. And he looked at these kind of messy, unstructured hospital charts of the era, and he saw something very wrong. He saw disordered notes reflecting disordered thinking. And he really believed that the way we document shapes the way we reason. So he introduced the problem-oriented medical record, the POMR. And what this did was it divided the record into a patient's problems one by one, and it required that each problem have its own structured entry, which of course is a format that we're all exceedingly familiar with today. And he also created what would become one of the most enduring frameworks in medicine still, which is the famous SOAP note, our subjective objective assessment plan. But importantly for Weed, again, the goal was never, bureaucracy or order. It was really cognitive clarity. He wanted the note to train physicians to think systematically, to move from observation to interpretation to action. So this is the 1968 New England Journal of Medicine paper, Medical Records That Guide and Teach. And in it, Weed argues that the medical record should serve as an educational tool requiring that the student, and this is a quote, go through the labor of organizing his thoughts and as a means of, quote, communication for all time between physicians and other members of the healthcare team. So he really insisted that the writing of the note be consistently performed with a high degree of intellectual attentiveness and rigor. But one of the things that is actually quite striking looking back now is what we didn't imagine. His model, impressive as it was entirely clinician facing. He really never addressed the idea that patients would one day read their own notes, let alone interact with them. And of course, this is a development that would transform the record yet again. So what if patients could read their own medical records? By the mid to late 20th century, medicine was starting to shift. It was starting to shift away from paternalism and really towards autonomy and shared decision making. And reflecting that change in 1973, only 5 years after Weed had published his essay, there were two physicians, Bud Shankin and David Werner, and they published their own paper in the journal, arguing that patients should have open access to their charts. And, their reasoning was surprisingly modern. They really believed that transparency could improve trust, accuracy, and collaboration. And they imagined a record that was not only a professional document, but a shared one. So something that could really strengthen the therapeutic alliance between doctor and patient. Of course, as we've seen for centuries now, the medical record had been written about patients, not for them, or at least not for them to read. So this would be quite a radical shift. And in fact, nothing really did shift, at least not right away. It took a number of years for this movement to take off and to gain traction. But of course, as we all know, things have certainly changed. So now we're going to fast forward again, almost 50 years until 2021, when under the 21st Century Cures Act, the OpenNotes provision goes into effect. And what this does, again, is it requires that patients be given real-time access to nearly all clinical notes. So suddenly, this medical record, this document that has, for as long as it's been in existence, really been kind of a pedagogical aid memoir intended for communication among providers, it really becomes a shared text. Doctors, patients, trainees, families, suddenly they're all reading the same words, often with very different expectations and interpretations. And, it's really, I think, rarely spoken of as such right now, but I actually think this has been one of the most profound cultural shifts in modern medicine. Um, the medical note has really had to start speaking two languages at once, one for the clinician and one for the patient. And, of course, that dual audience has had an impact on the way physicians write. And, I want to mention here as an aside that OpenNotes is actually something I'm completely in favor of. I think that patients should have access to their medical charts. I certainly want access to mine. But that doesn't mean that this initiative is free of complications. So, there have been studies from multiple countries at this point really showing that after OpenNotes or similar programs were implemented, doctors started to edit themselves. They started to soften their language, omit uncertainty, sometimes avoid sensitive topics altogether.
Mhm.
And so I want to just review a few of those studies here. So one of the clearest examples of this actually comes from Sweden, which was one of the first countries to implement a nationwide open access to clinical notes policy. And in a paper from 2020 in the Journal of Health Informatics, a national survey found that about 68% of oncologists reported changing how they wrote once a patient could read their notes online. We see a similar pattern in the United States. This is a recent study in JAMA Dermatology. And here it was found that once patients gained access to their reports, many dermatopathologists actually began changing how they described biopsy results. So words like suspicious for malignancy or cannot rule out melanoma were often softened or replaced with less suggestive or less definitive language. In psychiatry and psychology, this dynamic is perhaps even more pronounced. This is a study published in General Hospital Psychiatry in 2016, where they had their own kind of open access policy. And there, researchers at the VA, they looked at how mental health clinicians responded to notes being made available to patients. And so they surveyed over 260 VA psychiatrists, psychologists, and social workers about their experiences. And what they found was that most clinicians agreed that this kind of transparency was, in principle, at least a very good thing. But they also had significant concerns. Many of them worried that patients might misinterpret clinical terminology, that they might feel distressed by what they read, or that they might request changes be made to the record. Clinicians were, of course, especially uneasy about writing candidly about sensitive topics like suicidality, trauma, personality traits. And of course, this was really for fear of harming now the therapeutic alliance. And the last study I want to look at is really just to point out that these changes in how we write aren't limited to any one field. This was a large US survey of clinicians across multiple specialties. And what they found was that nearly 1 in 4 physicians now deliberately alters the way they document their differential diagnoses since the implementation of OpenNotes. So some remove uncertainty, others simplify complex reasoning that could confuse or alarm patients. And many have reported that, while transparency, again, is probably a good thing and may strengthen trust, it also may make notes less useful as tools for teaching and communication. So I do think it's worth, just emphasizing for a brief moment why doctors change what they write. Because I think in almost all cases, the reasons are very deeply human. Physicians want to spare patients confusion. They want to protect them from unnecessary worry. And they also want to maintain a separation between, kind of our cogitations, which might include rare diseases, those zebras that do have to be part of the differential, and then the objective facts of the medical visit. And so I also think it's worth stating, to this group in particular, that these tensions may be particularly salient in neurology. We have to confront a lot of diagnostic uncertainty, and probably more than most fields. And also, our patients may have cognitive changes that can complicate their comprehension. So it really does make a difference. But it's very much worth asking another question, which is what is lost when we simplify? When we simplify our notes to make them easier for our patients to read, do we also simplify our thinking? Do we lose the texture of clinical reasoning, the kind of gray zones, those provisional hypotheses, the kind of space for uncertainty? Do we lose the pedagogical value of the note? When every sentence really must be patient friendly, do we risk making our documentation very careful, very polite, but perhaps less useful, as a repository for our considerations and again, as a communication tool between colleagues? So, one way that physicians have tried to navigate this tension is this tension between writing for patients and writing for colleagues and for themselves is by inserting disclaimers into their notes. You may have seen some of these. It's kind of a short line at the top or bottom of the note that says something like, this note is intended for communication between medical professionals, or some terminology may be technical or abbreviated. And this one that I have up on the screen, this is a screenshot from, I just happened to come across this the other day as I was reading a note from a colleague. And this is a particularly long one. But I think that these disclaimers, they really do reflect our growing discomfort with the idea that this single document can serve both as a kind of, cognitive workspace, but also a patient-facing communication. And in some ways, I see these disclaimers as really kind of a plea. These doctors are really saying, let us keep our notes as what they have in many ways always been. They are a reminder to readers that medical language has its own logic, its own rhythm, and that it's not necessarily intended to be explanatory for patients. But I also think that even in that act of labeling, of disclaiming, of saying this note is for doctors, it really emphasizes how profoundly the audience has changed. Of course, some physicians have gone even one step further. I know that in my institution in Epic and in many other EMRs as well, there's now a sticky note feature. So this is an internal field where clinicians can write things that are not visible to patients. It's often used for small reminders, given context, sometimes for sensitive information that could be perhaps misunderstood. As far as I know, there are no real guidelines as far as what it is okay to use it for. I've seen people say things, like patient's family is concerned about dementia, or patient needs close follow-up for medication adherence. I'll be honest, I tend to use this feature for more of the social history aspects of the visit. If a patient is expecting a new grandchild in the next few months, or maybe what their names are, the grandchildren's names. So in some ways, I do think this feature has the potential to restore what OpenNotes has kind of removed. I don't know that many people use it this way, but it could potentially be a space for more candid reflection about the patient and their condition. But then if we're using it that way, it also creates this kind of strange bifurcation where you have a visible record and then you have a shadow record, and they're kind of serving different purposes. And I think it's also worth mentioning that it's probably only going to be a matter of time before there's a court case that dictates whether the sticky note really belongs, is part of the EMR, if it belongs to the physician, or if it belongs to the patient. And at that point, we probably can expect to be receiving some very clear guidance on how and when sticky notes should be used. So I want to come back now again to the central question. And as many of you are probably starting to suspect, this talk has more questions than it has answers. But I think that's important. I think that we all really need to be actively thinking about these things. we need to be asking ourselves, for whom should medical notes be written? For the physician to teach and reflect, for the patient to inform and empower, for the insurer to justify billing. And now, of course, we cannot ignore the idea that our notes are perhaps written both for and by artificial intelligence. So, obviously one could give many complete talks on this issue, but so much has changed since I first published the essay that I referenced on this topic just a year ago. And I really have no doubt that it will continue to proceed at kind of this exponential pace. So, I do want to address this because we really have to confront the fact that as though writing, for two audiences weren't enough, we're now really writing for a third. Artificial intelligence tools are increasingly reading our notes, they're extracting data, they're coding, they're generating summaries, they're predicting risk. And perhaps an even bigger issue is that AI isn't just reading our notes, it's also writing them. So I'm sure many people that are here today have already used AI to draft at least part of their notes, generate templates, or even transform dictation into clean prose. And in many ways, this is great. This can be really helpful, even liberating. It can improve efficiency. It may let us focus more on the patient than the computer during visits. But I think it also raises some deeper questions. So, when an algorithm is beginning to finish our sentences or even to start our sentences, whose reasoning does the note really reflect? And can we still say that it's a record of our own experiences and cognition? So, to understand just how much AI is already reshaping medicine, I wanted to share this article. Many of you probably already saw this and read it. It came out in the New Yorker just about a month ago. And it's If AI can diagnose patients, what are doctors for by Dhruv Kular. And it describes, among other things, how medical students and residents are now using large language models, including ChatGPT, to help them learn, study, and even reason through clinical cases. So I do want to just read part of this excerpt here. It's about a medical student on the wards during clinical rotations. And what it says is that for a time, this student found himself using AI after virtually every patient encounter. I started to feel dirty presenting my thoughts to attending physicians, knowing they were actually the AI's thoughts, he told me. One day, as he left the hospital, he had an unsettling realization. He hadn't thought about a single patient independently that day. He decided that from then on, he would force himself to settle on a diagnosis before consulting artificial intelligence. I went to medical school to become a real, capital D, doctor, he told me. If all you do is plug symptoms into an AI, are you still a doctor, or are you just slightly better at prompting AI than your patients? So give that a second to sink in. But, on that note, I do think it's really important and worth looking forward to a future where we are hopefully making the best use of AI, really incorporating it wisely into our workflows without allowing it to completely take over our ability to think critically and reason and write. So I just want to look at a few of these potential future directions. There are several new studies that have come out just within the past year or so that are pointing towards how AI may be reshaping both clinical documentation and also the OpenNotes movement. So this first one is a recent study from JAMA Open Network. It's from NYU, I believe, and it showed that large language models could rewrite discharge summaries into language that patients actually understand. So instead of a sixth grade reading level, instead of an 11th, and then preserving accuracy in most cases. This is another article looking at intelligent clinical documentation. So using speech recognition and large language models to generate structured notes directly from the doctor-patient conversation. That's already being done often, but this particular model was making a concerted effort to generate notes that really recenter the patient in that encounter and in that final product. This is another recent study. In this one, I thought this was interesting because patients actually were able to submit questions about their clinical notes to three different LLMs. And interestingly, the best responses apparently came about when the AI was prompted to adopt a persona of the treating clinician. This is a study out of NYU that shows that AI feedback on physician notes actually improves documentation, and they did show that there were some measurable gains in assessment, quality, and care planning. And then finally, and of course there are many more than this, but finally I did want to share this one because this is about OpenNotes directly. And OpenNotes has partnered with the company Abridge. And what they're doing is they're studying how AI generated visit summaries affect real patients and testing whether these summaries are not only accurate, but maybe can even be genuinely useful and comprehensible to patients. So where does that leave us now? You know, across centuries, from the physicians of Coss to Virchow's casebooks to Larry Weed's soap note, writing really has been one of medicine's ways of remembering, reflecting, and reasoning. And I hope I have convinced you that the medical note has really never been just a record. It's been a cognitive instrument, a teaching tool, and a bridge between observation and understanding. And I think what we have to come to terms with is the fact that that bridge is now wider. Our notes are no longer written just about patients, but with them, and increasingly through machines. OpenNotes gave patients a voice in their own records, and AI now offers us another partner in authorship. And I think this actually brings us way back to the beginning of the talk, to the second study I mentioned, where writing collectively and in dialogue actually led to improved critical thinking dispositions. So, an improved willingness to question and also better metacognitive awareness. And I've really myself been thinking about how that idea maps onto the evolution of the medical note. For so long, these notes were really a monologue. They were the physician's voice, defining, interpreting, and concluding. But that's shifting. And in other words, the note has entered its dialogical phase. So, personally, I am very hopeful that if we engage with that dialogue very intentionally, if we use writing not to replace our thinking, but to extend it, then notes. And yes, we may need AI to help us create, multiple different versions of notes for different purposes. But I am hopeful that notes can still be places where we're able to reason and reflect and understand. I think that this presents a real challenge, but also a real opportunity. But ultimately, writing, whether it's papyrus or SOAP format or co-authored with AI, it still serves the same purpose. I think that it helps us see what we think and also think about what we see. And so I will stop there and take any questions.
Wow. Thank you so much, Dr. Wise. This is such an amazing topic. I've always wanted to learn how these like note-taking history changes, especially I came from a place like where we have only two main hospitals for the whole country, and we only have three neurologists for the whole upper Burma. When you showed me the Charité hospital, it looks exactly like the hospital where I got trained. And everything is all handwritten. We have to when we have to get the lab reports, the workers have to bring all of these lab reports to our department. And then whenever we have to refer to other specialties, we have to take all bunch of the patients note in a basket, and then we go all around the hospital compound.
Wow.
Yeah, so I've always wanted to learn how these notes takings have changed. We still do handwriting, and some of these private hospitals, they're trying to do electronic medical records, but it's only for like most of lab reports to see and check electronically. But still, like all of these others, history examinations are just all handwritten. So
Yeah,
thank
I think that's so, thank you for sharing that. I think that's so interesting. And, you bring up another point that I didn't even get into here, which is, another thing that happens with this technology is that really widens the divide, in terms of how medicine is practiced in different parts of the world. So I think that that'll be another very important and interesting component of this as we move forward.
Yes, exactly. And other, I still have a lot of questions about the AI. If anyone want to also ask questions to Dr. Wise, please feel free to stop and ask. Here we are starting to do all these like electronic medical records and notes taking. And with the usage of AI, how was your insight that do you think AI tools can be trained or designed to better understand the narrative and the contents of a patient story and not just interpreting the data? Um,
Yeah,
what?
I do. I do think so. I mean, I think that, the A it's still in its infancy. And I think what will happen is that it will become trained much more within subspecialties. And so it will, really pick up on the nuances of each of those subspecialties. I mean, I know I'm in movement disorders, and the way we write about patients is different even than someone in, neuromuscular, even within neurology. So I do think that that will happen and probably pretty quickly. But, my concern about it is the same because personally for me, I feel that when I am there's something about writing that narrative myself and taking the time to reflect on it and thinking to myself, as I'm writing down the exam findings, I'm thinking about that patient and their kind of corporeality, and I'm thinking about their poise and what they looked like, and things might even come to me that I didn't, take down initially or say out loud. So I do think it will get much better, but I still raise the question of, what do we lose?
Yeah, definitely. Thank you, Dr. Wise. Oh, my dear, please go ahead.
I'll let one of our guests here go first. I think
Yeah,
Lainey Ross.
Danielle Ross, could you
Sure,
please?
thank you. So, Lainey Ross, I'm a pediatrician and philosopher. Thank you. That was a great discussion. One of the things that I think will get lost, and I'd like your comment on it, is as you were saying, after you see a patient, or after I see a patient, I sort of want to take everything I've heard and synthesize it, decide what I think is important, and restructure that conversation into how I think it's going to help me get to the best differential diagnosis. And if I have, some computer just transcribing the entire conversation, first it's going to be linear, and it's also just not going to put the emphasis where I would. And I was just curious what you thought about that and what you think that will do for doctors' ability to actually make up differential diagnoses.
Yeah, I mean, I completely agree with you. And again, I mean, I think this probably varies somewhat among doctors, but yeah, I think that I am somebody who's always, put a lot of effort into creating that narrative, and making it chronological, making, the pertinent details stand out, and then using that, just like you said, to really create a thoughtful assessment, and differential. And I think it's a skill like any other that if you don't use, you will lose, which is, one of the reasons I was so concerned when I read that New Yorker article to see that medical students are not even, doing that during medical school now. Again, I don't want to sound like a Luddite. I mean, I think that there are real advantages to AI, and I also think it's not going anywhere. So we really need to find ways to incorporate it, but I think that the best that we can do is really try to be in dialogue with it. And really also we may have to, put limits on ourselves, really put governors on in terms of what we allow it to do so that those skills that we now possess don't erode.
Thank you, Dr. Wise. There's also a question in the chat. George Patino, he said, I don't see us going back to handwritten notes just for efficiency, but do you think there could be some advantages when writing notes by hand? Maybe having more time to think about things or even activating some areas of the brain that allow for retaining more information, creating associations, etc.
Yeah, I mean, I think probably there are advantages. I think that unfortunately, given, the way most people's clinic day is structured, I don't know that that will happen, as you said. Um, I mean, it's interesting. There are actually some studies that show that even there is a difference between writing out letters by hand and typing letters, because I mean, just the tactile sensation is quite different, So the way that it's activating the brain is actually quite different as well. So absolutely, I think there would be benefits to that. But, I will be the first to admit that if I write more than a few sentences, my hand starts to cramp. So, I think that that's probably not the direction we're going in. I will also say that when I see patients in the office now in movement disorders, we always do a writing sample. And I have so many patients where I ask them, has your handwriting changed? And I would say the majority of them now say, I have no idea, because they really aren't writing, So yes, I love the idea. Not sure it'll happen.
Uh, Thank you, Dr. Wise. Matia, do you want to go ahead with your questions?
Yeah, I just shared in the chat what my wife contributed to. She said that it's much easier to write,
Handwrite.
to handwrite. My question though was around what you were saying earlier about OpenNotes, and also how physicians have changed how they write things because they know the patient will read them. And it's so interesting. I do this as well, but it's so interesting to think about how on the one hand, OpenNotes was an effort to decrease the paternalistic element to medicine, but we know that at the end of the day, when we communicate with patients, we still want to protect them. We still want to give them what we think and not all the possibility, all the scary possibilities. So I see there a little bit of a tension between what the initiative was for and then what we end up doing practically. So I'm really curious to hear your thoughts about this tension, Adina, because I think it's
Yeah.
out there.
No, I think you hit on, really one of the most important aspects of this, that, absolutely the intention of open notes is wonderful, but we have all seen the reality, of what happens if we put things in notes that, patients may become anxious about, that may confuse our patients. And so, of course, that's going to impact behavior. Um, and I don't know. I mean, I don't have the answer, but I think, yes, even just philosophically, it brings up a lot of questions about, can we as providers ever really completely get away from this kind of like, protective paternalistic attitude in how we approach care. Because we do, by definition, we know more about medicine than our patients do, or most of them anyway, unless they're doctors. And so, there is absolutely, I think you put it perfectly. There's an inherent tension there that I don't think Open Notes has found a way to solve for. Yeah.
Very well said. Yeah, what you were saying also about care, right? Because ultimately we're in the field of health care. So we not only care for our own little field, but also care for the patient in a more global way. So it's interesting to think about the tension. Thank you so much. This
Yeah,
talk
yeah,
was
and I think the intentions are so positive. Whenever I've spoken to a colleague who has said, oh, I didn't want to write this in there. I've had people come to me sometimes and say, hey, I want to give you a heads up about this patient you're seeing next week. I didn't want to put this in the note. I mean, that happens. And it's it's never out of, wanting to be covert or secretive. It's always out of an instinct for care, but that could also be construed as paternalistic. So yeah, I don't have an answer, but I think it's a really salient point.
Yeah, that's a good point. And Galina also bring up the insight. She said open notes, but is it open dialogue? So, Galina, do you want to share some insight?
No, I was just commenting on everything that Dina has already said, and just and Mattia raising the point about there's a difference between what we choose to disclose and what we put in our note. And I don't know that that's always been a full the case, even when the notes weren't there, weren't fully, weren't being read by patients. Because there's something that I mean, maybe I'll turn it to a question. I did find it interesting, Adina, when you said that the note is kind of the cognitive, playground. And I guess what are your thoughts for if the note isn't going to be that, though you propose that it could be if we remain in dialogue, where are the other places for that cognitive playground to be?
If not in the medical note. Yeah, I think that's a really good question. And it's something, I worry about, frankly. I think that we have to be very intentional in how we think about that, particularly at the training level. I think that, and I wrote about this a little bit in the article, but we may get to a point where we really do have to focus with trainees on the case report, for instance. Case reports are still a place where patients are not usually reading those. They're welcome to, of course, but it is a place where you can really apply clinical reasoning and explore different thought processes around certain patients. And we may just really have to find very dedicated ways to make sure that those critical thinking skills are still being developed. I think particularly for students and trainees, I think how we do it, once physicians are in practice is going to be much harder because, I think actually there's a lot less of an ability to control the way that we, manage our practices then. And if somebody wants to, at this point, use AI for all of their note writing, I mean, really they can do that. So I think it's a really good open question. And I think, the best thing we can probably do for now is make sure that we are instilling that as a value within trainees so that, once they get to practice, at least they will have had that experience and hopefully it will, it'll have some durability.
Yeah. Thank you, Dr. Wise. I'm sure there are a lot of state questions and thoughts after this meeting. We just have one quick questions to address from the chat. She's asking, do you think AI systems having an option for patients to choose from transparent versus sensitive versions would help?
That's such a good question. And it's interesting because I think that there are some patients that kind of self-select for this already. Personally, I have patients who say to me, I saw, I got a notification that my MRI results came back, but I didn't open them, and there are certainly patients who kind of understand themselves enough and how they might respond to information to wait for the doctor to kind of provide an explanation. So yeah, I think for some patients that would be quite helpful, for patients who kind of have that awareness and can say, okay, you know what, I'm somebody who does want the sensitive version, perhaps. I think that is one interesting idea. But I still think there's going to be a sizable cohort that is going to, ask for the completely transparent data and that may, trigger some complications.
Thank you, Dr. Wise. I think it's for the sake of the time. I'm sure we still have a lot of questions and great thoughts after this meeting. Galina, please go ahead with the other ending slides.
Yeah, well, a huge thank you to Dr. Wise once again for taking us on this incredible thought journey. If you enjoyed what you heard, please join us for next month's seminar where we're going to be hearing from Dr. Federico Rodriguez Porcel on his talk From Borges to the Neurology Clinic, Navigating the Limits and Opportunities of Language. Meet us next month, this time 8 to 9 p.m. Eastern on the 19th. And we are extremely excited to announce, last year we had 2 contests to promote engagement within the Neurohumanities Network, and we're excited to announce this year's contest Last year was Halloween themed. We're too close to Halloween, so we're going to move on to Thanksgiving. And at least in the US, we are celebrating a month of gratitude and giving thanks. And so we're putting out to the network this question: what are you grateful for? And inviting you to submit. And we tried to find a very generic word. So art or work or any kind of expression of creativity in any medium. You'll have to figure out a way to email us, but maybe it's a photo of something that is, a sculpture. That's allowed too. Any medium to express your gratitude this season, what it means to you, maybe what you're grateful for. Email us by the end of November, and we are voting on a favorite because we didn't think that's fair, but anyone who submits will be entered into a raffle to win a gift card, and we'll put our email in the chat. We'll also announce this in our newsletter and on our website, so please celebrate the month of giving thanks. And I'll start by just saying I'm thankful for Adina and for once again giving me something to think about, and for all of you for joining us tonight. We hope to see you next month.
Thank you so much. This was great. Take care.
Thank you, everyone. Thanks, Adina. Have a good night, everyone.